Sometimes a single moment changes everything you thought you knew about human dignity. For Elena, that moment came when a stranger refused to look away from her suffering. In post-Civil War Texas, she lived as the personal property of a cruel land baron. This strong Mexican woman endured years of treatment no person should face. Then Caleb Hart rode into town. The towering ex-Confederate soldier carried his own demons from the war. When he saw Elena's situation, he made a choice that would change both their lives forever. He broke her chains. This single act sparked violence across the frontier settlement. Now they must run together across the harsh Texas landscape. Two broken souls found each other in the darkest of times. But can their growing love survive the hatred chasing them? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The sun had barely crested the horizon when Elena Martinez knelt in the dusty corner of her small room, her fingers working the worn wooden beads of her rosary. Each bead told a story of survival, of prayers whispered in the darkness, when hope seemed as distant as the mountains on the horizon. The rosary had belonged to her grandmother, passed down through generations of strong women who had faced their own trials with faith as their compass. Ave Maria, llena eres de gracia, she whispered. The familiar Spanish words, a comfort in a world that had tried to strip away everything she was. The prayer was a quiet rebellion, spoken in the language Baron Whitmore had forbidden her to use. But in these precious moments before dawn, when the house still slept, Elena reclaimed pieces of her soul. Through the small window above her narrow bed, she could see the main street of Redemption Flats beginning to stir. The town had earned its name during the war, when deserters from both armies sought sanctuary in its dusty embrace. Now, 2 years after Appomattox, it remained a place where men came to forget their pasts, though the weight of memory seemed to hang over everything like the persistent Texas heat. Elena rose from her knees, tucking the rosary beneath her simple cotton dress. The silver cross that had once hung beside it was gone, torn away during one of the Baron's rages 3 months ago. She still felt its absence like a physical wound, but the rosary remained her anchor, hidden close to her heart, where even Whitmore couldn't reach. The floorboards creaked beneath her bare feet as she moved to the wash basin. The face that looked back at her from the cracked mirror bore the marks of her 26 years, though her eyes held depths that spoke of experiences far beyond her age. High cheekbones inherited from her Aztec ancestors, framed eyes the color of rich earth, and despite years of hardship, her posture remained straight and proud. "Elena!" The Baron's voice boomed from downstairs, making her stomach clench. "Get down here, girl!" She closed her eyes for a moment, drawing strength from somewhere deep within. Then she straightened her shoulders and walked toward another day of survival. Redemption Flats sprawled along the banks of a creek that ran dry more often than not. Its buildings a mixture of weathered wood and adobe that reflected the town's mixed heritage. The war had brought together Texans, Mexicans, freed slaves, and drifters from across the country, creating an uneasy community bound together by necessity more than understanding. At the town's heart stood the Cattleman's Rest, a saloon that never seemed to close, where men drank away their ghosts and occasionally found the courage to start over. Across the street, a small church struggled to keep its congregation, presided over by Father Miguel, an elderly Mexican priest who had somehow earned even the Baron's grudging respect. Sheriff Morrison kept the peace with a combination of wisdom and worn authority, his gray hair and weathered hands speaking of years spent walking the line between justice and survival. He'd been a Texas Ranger before the war, and though his jurisdiction was small now, his reputation for fairness had helped Redemption Flats maintain a fragile stability. It was into this world that Caleb Hart rode as the morning light painted the desert in shades of gold and red. His horse's hooves raised small clouds of dust as he made his way down the main street, his presence drawing curious glances from the early risers. He was a big man, tall and broad-shouldered, with the kind of presence that made people take notice even when he wasn't trying to command attention. The Confederate officer's compass in his saddlebag had guided him across half of Texas, though its needle seemed to spin wildly these days, as unreliable as his own sense of direction. The brass was tarnished now. The glass cracked from a fall during a skirmish outside Atlanta, but he kept it still, a reminder of a time when he'd known his purpose, even if that purpose had led him down a path he now regretted. Caleb's dark hair was longer than military regulation allowed, and a beard covered the lower half of his face, both serving to hide the young colonel he'd once been. His grey eyes held a wariness that came from seeing too much, but there was something else there too, a searching quality, as if he was looking for something he couldn't quite name. He guided his horse toward the livery stable, nodding to the few townspeople who met his gaze. Most looked away quickly, recognizing the controlled tension in his movements, the way his hand naturally rested near the colt at his hip. They'd seen enough soldiers, both blue and gray, to know the signs of a man still fighting his own war. "Morning," he said to the stable hand, a young man with curious eyes and work-worn hands. "Need a stall for my horse and directions to a place that serves decent coffee." "Mornin', stranger. Name's Tommy. Coffee's best at Miss Sarah's boarding house, though the Cattleman's Rest opens early if you prefer something stronger with your breakfast." The young man's voice held the careful politeness of someone who'd learned to read strangers quickly. Caleb dismounted, his movements fluid, despite the stiffness that came from weeks in the saddle. "Coffee sounds perfect. I'm Caleb Hart." "Pleasure, Mr. Hart. You passing through or thinking of staying a while?" It was an innocent question, but Caleb paused before answering. He'd been asking himself the same thing for months now, drifting from town to town, without finding whatever it was he sought. "Depends on what I find here, I suppose." As he walked toward Miss Sarah's boarding house, his attention was caught by movement in an upstairs window of the large house that dominated the north end of town. For just a moment, he glimpsed a woman's profile, the curve of a cheek, the line of a shoulder, before a curtain fell back into place. Something about the glimpse made him pause, though he couldn't say why. The boarding house was a two-story structure that had seen better days, but maintained a dignity in its weathered boards and carefully tended flower boxes. Miss Sarah herself was a woman in her 60s, with steel-grey hair pulled back in a practical bun and eyes that missed very little. "You'll be wanting breakfast, I expect," she said before Caleb could speak. "Most men with your look about them are running on empty stomachs and short patience." Caleb found himself almost smiling at her directness. "Coffee, definitely, and whatever you'd recommend for a man who's been eating his own cooking for too long. Eggs, bacon, and biscuits it is. Find yourself a seat and I'll bring it out directly." The common room was simple but clean, with mismatched chairs around sturdy tables and the kind of atmosphere that invited conversation without demanding it. Two other men sat at separate tables, both with the look of travelers who'd found temporary refuge. Neither seemed interested in company, which suited Caleb fine. As he waited for his meal, Caleb found his thoughts returning to that glimpse in the window. There had been something in the woman's posture, a quality he couldn't shake, a stillness that spoke of waiting, of endurance. He'd seen it before in prisoners of war and in the faces of civilians caught in the path of armies. It was the look of someone who had learned to survive by becoming invisible. Miss Sarah returned with coffee strong enough to wake the dead and a plate piled high with food that reminded him why he'd missed home cooking. As she set it down, she studied his face with the frank assessment of a woman who'd fed half the drifters in Texas. "You've got the look of a soldier about you," she observed not unkindly. "Most who come through here do, one way or another. War leaves marks on a man that don't wash off easy." Caleb nodded, not trusting his voice for a moment. "Confederate. Third Corps under General Hill. Well, war's over now, whatever uniform you wore. In Redemption Flats, we judge a man by what he does today, not what he did yesterday. She paused, glancing toward the window that faced the Baron's house. Course some folks have harder times letting go of their yesterdays than others. There was weight in those words, a meaning that went deeper than casual conversation. Caleb followed her gaze, noting the way her expression tightened slightly as she looked at the large house. "That'd be Baron Whitmore's place," she said, the title carrying a slight edge of distaste. "Calls himself a baron anyway. Made his fortune in land deals during and after the war, owns most of the good grazing land around here now, and the people who used to own it?" Caleb asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. Miss Sarah's lips pressed into a thin line. "Gone, mostly. Some sold out fair and square, needing the money after losing everything else. Others—" She shrugged, but her eyes hardened. "Well, legal and right ain't always the same thing, especially when lawyers get involved." Caleb ate in contemplative silence, absorbing the undercurrents of tension that seemed to run through the town like an underground river. Every community had its secrets, its unspoken grievances, but there was something particular about Redemption Flats that he couldn't quite identify. Maybe it was the way people's eyes shifted when they looked toward the Baron's house, or the careful neutrality in their voices when they spoke of local affairs. He was finishing his second cup of coffee when he saw her clearly for the first time. Elena emerged from the Baron's house carrying a basket, her head covered with a simple shawl that couldn't completely hide the rich darkness of her hair. Even from across the street, Caleb could see the unconscious grace in her movements, the way she held herself with quiet dignity despite the simple, almost shabby dress she wore. But it was her eyes that captured him. Even at this distance, he could see something in them that made his chest tighten, a combination of strength and weariness that spoke of battles fought and survived. She moved like someone accustomed to being watched, to having her every action scrutinized and judged. She walked toward the general store. Caleb noticed other things. The way men on the street either stared too openly or looked away too quickly. The way the few women in sight whispered behind their hands, their expressions a mixture of pity and something else. Fear, perhaps, or the uncomfortable relief of those who knew they were safe from a fate that had befallen another. "That's Elena," Miss Sarah said quietly, having followed his gaze. "Poor things had a harder road than most. She works for the Baron." Miss Sarah's expression grew carefully neutral, the look of someone who knew when to speak and when to keep silent. "She lives there, yes, has for several years now." There was more to the story, much more, but Caleb could see that Miss Sarah had shared all she felt comfortable sharing with a stranger. He watched as Elena disappeared into the general store, noting the way she kept her head down, avoided eye contact with the other customers. A few minutes later, she emerged with her basket. But as she started back toward the Baron's house, a commotion erupted from that direction. A man's voice, loud, angry, and slurred with drink despite the early hour, carried across the morning air. "Elena, where the hell are you, girl? Get back here now!" The effect on Elena was immediate and heartbreaking. Her shoulders sagged slightly, and the careful composure she'd maintained crumbled just enough for Caleb to see the fear beneath. She quickened her pace, almost running now, the basket clutched tight against her chest. Caleb found himself standing without conscious decision, his hand moving instinctively toward his gun. Several other men on the street had stopped to watch, their faces showing varying degrees of discomfort and resignation. This was clearly not an unusual occurrence. "Easy there, son," Miss Sarah said softly, placing a weathered hand on his arm. "That's a road with no good ending for anyone brave enough to walk it." But Caleb's eyes remained fixed on Elena as she disappeared into the Baron's house, and something deep in his chest, something he'd thought the war had burned out of him, began to stir. It felt like purpose, like the first true north his moral compass had shown in years. He didn't know Eleanor's full story yet, didn't understand the exact nature of her relationship to Baron Whitmore, or the source of the fear he'd seen in her eyes. But he recognized the signs of someone living under another person's absolute control, someone whose freedom had been stolen so completely that she'd learned to make herself invisible just to survive. Caleb Hart had spent the last 2 years trying to forget the things he'd done in service to a cause he no longer believed in. He'd been drifting, searching for something to redeem the parts of his soul that the war had stained, looking at that house where Eleanor had disappeared, watching the way the whole town seemed to hold its breath whenever Baron Whitmore's voice carried on the wind. Caleb began to think he might have found his purpose at last. The morning sun climbed higher, painting Redemption Flats in harsh light and deep shadows. In the boarding house, a Confederate veteran finished his coffee and made a decision that would change everything. Across the street, a Mexican woman knelt beside her narrow bed and prayed for strength to endure another day. Neither knew that their lives were about to become forever intertwined, bound together by a shared understanding of what it meant to search for redemption in a world that offered precious little mercy to those who needed it most. 3 days passed before Caleb saw Elena again, though her image had lingered in his thoughts like smoke from a dying fire. He'd spent the time getting his bearings in Redemption Flats, taking meals at Miss Sarah's and making the kind of polite conversation that revealed little but observed much. The town had accepted his presence with the wary tolerance reserved for drifters who minded their own business, and he'd been content to let them think that's all he was. But on the 4th morning, as he sat on the boarding house porch with his coffee and watched the town come to life, he witnessed something that shattered any pretense of being just another passing stranger. Elena emerged from the Baron's house as she had before, carrying her basket and moving with that same careful grace, but this time something was different. Even from across the street, Caleb could see a purple bruise along her left cheekbone, and the way she favored her right side when she walked told him there were other injuries hidden beneath her clothes. She made it halfway to the general store before Baron Whitmore appeared in his doorway, his bulk filling the frame as his voice carried across the morning air with the ugly authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "Elena, get back here, you worthless!" The string of epithets that followed made Caleb's jaw clench. He'd heard worse language in army camps, but there was a particular venom in Whitmore's tone, a deliberate cruelty that went beyond mere anger. Elena stopped walking, but didn't turn around immediately. Caleb could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her free hand moved unconsciously to touch something at her throat, a gesture that spoke of old comfort now absent. "I said, get back here." Whitmore's voice rose, drawing stares from other people on the street. Most quickly found reasons to look elsewhere, but Caleb found himself standing, his hand resting on the porch railing, as something cold and familiar settled in his chest. Elena turned then, and even at this distance, Caleb could see the resignation in her posture. She began walking back toward the house, each step measured and deliberate, like a condemned prisoner walking to the gallows. Whitmore met her at the gate, his meaty hand shooting out to grab her arm with enough force that she stumbled. The basket fell from her other hand, spilling its contents into the dust. When she bent to retrieve them, Whitmore's boot connected with her shoulder, sending her sprawling. "Clumsy Mexican witch," he snarled, loud enough for half the street to hear. "Can't even walk without making a mess." That's when Caleb saw it. The silver cross necklace that had been torn from Elena's throat, glinting in the morning sun as it lay in the dirt beside the scattered vegetables. She reached for it with desperate fingers, but Whitmore's boot came down again, this time on her wrist. Elena's sharp intake of breath was audible even across the street, and something inside Caleb snapped like a bowstring pulled too tight. He was moving before conscious thought took hold, his long strides eating up the distance between the boarding house and the Baron's gate. "Problem here." His voice carried the kind of quiet authority he'd once used to rally troops before battle, and it had the desired effect. Whitmore looked up, his small eyes narrowing as they took in this tall stranger who dared to interfere. In his business. No problem that concerns you, friend, Whitmore said, though his tone suggested they were anything but friends. Just disciplining my property. The word hit Caleb like a physical blow. Property. As if Elena were livestock or furniture instead of a human being. His hand moved instinctively toward his gun, but he forced himself to stop. Drawing iron would only make things worse for Elena. Once he was gone, "Your property seems to be hurt," Caleb said evenly, extending his hand toward Elena. "Let me help her up." "You'll do no such thing." Whitmore stepped between them, his bulk imposing despite his shorter stature. "This is my land, my house, and she belongs to me. You'd do well to remember that and move along." Caleb's eyes met Elena's over Whitmore's shoulder, and what he saw there made his chest tighten. Not just fear or pain, but a kind of desperate hope warring with ingrained caution. She was looking at him like he might be salvation, but her expression also warned him away, as if she couldn't bear to see another person hurt because of her. "Mom," Caleb said, speaking directly to Eleanor and ignoring Whitmore entirely. You all right?" It was Elena who answered, her voice soft but steady despite the tremor that ran through it. "I am fine, Signor. Thank you for your concern." Her English was careful and precise, touched with an accent that spoke of education and refinement, not the broken speech Whitmore's treatment might have led him to expect. There were depths to Eleanor that her circumstances couldn't hide, layers of dignity that no amount of cruelty could completely strip away. "You heard her," Whitmore said with ugly satisfaction. "She's fine. Now get off my property before I call the sheriff." "Actually, we're on the public street," Caleb observed mildly, though his muscles remained coiled for action. "And I believe the lady dropped something." He knelt and retrieved the silver cross from the dust, brushing it clean with gentle fingers before holding it out to Elena. The gesture was simple, but the symbolism was profound. In that moment, he was acknowledging her humanity, her worth, her right to possess something precious. Elena's eyes filled with tears as she reached for the necklace, but Whitmore's hand shot out to intercept it. "That belongs to me now," he said, snatching the cross from Caleb's fingers. "Everything she has belongs to me." The casual theft, performed in broad daylight with the confidence of a man who believed himself untouchable, was the final straw. Caleb's hand closed over Whitmore's wrist with enough pressure to make the Baron's eyes widen. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," Caleb said quietly. "That necklace doesn't belong to you." "The hell it doesn't. I own her, which means I own everything she has. Now let go of me before—" Whitmore never finished the threat. Caleb's grip tightened just enough to cut off circulation, and the Baron's face began to redden. Around them, a small crowd had gathered, drawn by the confrontation, but keeping their distance from the two men. Locked in silent battle. "Nobody owns her," Caleb said, his voice carrying clearly in the morning air. "Nobody owns anybody. War's over, in case you hadn't heard." "She's not a slave, you fool," Whitmore gasped, trying unsuccessfully to free his wrist. "She's bound by debt, legal and proper. Her family owed money when they died, and she's working it off." It was a lie. Caleb could see it in the man's eyes, in the way Eleanor's face went pale at the casual mention of her dead family. But it was the kind of lie that probably held up in whatever passed for law in this part of Texas. The kind of legal fiction that allowed men like Whitmore to possess what they couldn't legitimately own. "How much debt?" Caleb asked, his grip loosening slightly. $5,000, Whitmore said quickly, sensing an opportunity. "Plus interest and room and board. Call it 7,000 all told." Another lie, almost certainly inflated beyond all reason, but Caleb found himself nodding. "I'll buy her contract." The words surprised even him. He had maybe $400 to his name, nowhere near enough to meet Whitmore's fabricated price. But something in Elena's expression, the way hope and disbelief warred across her features, made him commit to a course of action he couldn't afford and hadn't planned. "You don't have that kind of money," Whitmore said with ugly confidence. "Maybe not today, Caleb admitted, "but I know where to get it." He was thinking of his uncle's ranch in Colorado, the inheritance he'd never claimed because it felt too much like profiting from the war. But looking at Elena's face, at the mixture of gratitude and terror in her eyes, he began to see a different kind of profit. The kind measured in human dignity rather than dollars. Whitmore released Elena's wrist and stepped back, his expression calculating. "Even if you could raise the money, what makes you think I want to sell? Elena's been very useful to me over the years." The implication in his tone made Caleb's vision narrow to a red haze, and it was only Eleanor's sharp intake of breath that kept him from doing something irrevocable. Instead, he forced himself to smile, the cold, predatory smile that had once struck fear into Confederate enemies. "Oh, I think we'll come to an arrangement," he said softly. "One way or another." The threat hung in the morning air like smoke from gunpowder. Whitmore was many things, but he wasn't stupid. He could read the promise of violence in Caleb's eyes. The coiled readiness of a man who had killed before and would kill again if necessary. "Think about my offer," Caleb said, releasing Whitmore's wrist and stepping back. "I'll be in town for a few more days." He turned to Eleanor, who was still kneeling. In the dust, her hand pressed against her injured wrist. "Ma'am," he said formally, touching the brim of his hat, "I apologize for any trouble I may have caused you." Elena looked up at him, and for a moment the careful mask she wore slipped entirely. In her eyes he saw gratitude and hope, but also a kind of desperate warning, as if she was trying to tell him that his interference had signed both their death warrants. "Vaya con Dios," she whispered. "Go with God." Caleb walked back toward the boarding house, every step measured and deliberate. Behind him, he could hear Whitmore's voice, low and venomous, as he berated Elena for the scene she had caused. The sound made his teeth clench, but he forced himself to keep walking. He'd made his play, drawn his line in the dust. Now he had to figure out how to back up his words with action, how to turn empty threats into Elena's freedom. The war had taught him many things, but perhaps the most important lesson was this: sometimes a man had to choose between what was safe and what was right. Looking back at Elena as she gathered the scattered contents of her basket, her mother's silver cross still in Whitmore's possession, Caleb Hart knew he'd already made his choice. The clock in the church tower struck midnight as Caleb made his way through the shadows toward the Baron's house. His worn leather gloves, stained with years of hard work and the memory of violence, felt different tonight. For too long, his hands had been instruments of destruction, first in war and then in the aimless drifting that followed. Tonight, they would be used for something else entirely. He'd spent the evening at the Cattleman's Rest, nursing whiskey and listening to the talk that flowed around him like water around stones. The regulars spoke carefully when Baron Whitmore's name came up, but alcohol loosened tongues enough for Caleb to piece together a clearer picture of Eleanor's situation. She'd arrived in Redemption Flats 4 years ago, they said, after her family's ranch was burned out during a dispute over water rights. Whitmore had graciously offered to help her, taking her in when she had nowhere else to go. The story had the ring of truth twisted into comfortable lies, the kind of half-truths that let decent people sleep at night while injustice flourished. In plain sight, what they didn't say spoke louder than their words. The way conversations died when Elena was mentioned, the uncomfortable shifting when someone accidentally referred to her as the Baron's woman rather than his housekeeper. The careful way they avoided discussing exactly what services she provided in exchange for room and board. Caleb had seen enough of the world to read between those lines, and what he saw there made his jaw clench with barely controlled fury. The Baron's house sat on a rise overlooking the town, its windows dark except for a single light in what appeared to be the kitchen. Caleb moved like the soldier he'd once been, keeping to the shadows and using the scattered outbuildings for cover. His boots made no sound on the packed earth as he approached the servants' entrance he'd observed during his reconnaissance. The door was locked, but locks were suggestions to a man who'd spent months behind enemy lines. He had it open in less. Then a minute, the soft click of the mechanism lost in the whisper of night wind through the eaves. Inside, the house was silent except for the rhythmic snoring that drifted from the Baron's room upstairs. Caleb moved through the kitchen and down a narrow hallway, following the layout he'd memorized from watching the house for 3 days. Elena's room was at the back, little more than a storage closet with a window, the same window where he'd first glimpsed her profile. He found her awake, sitting on the edge of her narrow bed with her rosary in her hands. She looked up as his shadow filled the doorway, and though her eyes widened with surprise, she made no sound of alarm. "Signor Hart," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "you should not be here." "Neither should you," he replied just as quietly, stepping into the room and closing the door behind him. "Not like this." In the moonlight streaming through her small window, he could see the full extent of the damage Whitmore had inflicted after their confrontation. The bruise on her cheek had darkened to purple-black, and she held her left arm carefully against her body. Her simple nightgown did little to hide the other bruises that mottled her shoulders and arms. "He hurt you because of me," Caleb said, the words heavy with guilt. Elena shook her head, her dark hair falling like a curtain around her face. "He hurt me because that is what he does. Your intervention gave him an excuse, nothing more. I'm getting you out of here. And then what?" Her question carried the weight of 4 years' worth of hard-won wisdom. "Where would we go? How would we live? He owns half the territory between here and the Mexican border. His reach is long and his memory longer." Caleb knelt beside her bed, bringing himself to her eye level. Up close, he could see the intelligence in her gaze, the strength that had kept her alive through years of unimaginable hardship. This was no helpless victim waiting for rescue. This was a survivor who had learned to calculate odds and weigh risks with the precision of a military strategist. "I have family in Colorado," he said. "A ranch my uncle left me when he died. We could go there, start over." "We." The single word carried a world of questions. Caleb felt heat rise in his cheeks. "I mean, I'm offering you a place, honest work, honest wages, a chance to live free." Elena studied his face in the moonlight, searching for something she apparently found. "Why, you do not know me? You owe me nothing." It was a fair question, and one he'd been asking himself since the moment he'd intervened in the street. The easy answer was that no person deserved to live as Elena did. But looking at her now, at the quiet dignity she maintained even in these desperate circumstances, he recognized something deeper. "Maybe I'm the one who needs rescuing," he said finally. "I've been drifting for 2 years, looking for something worth fighting for. Something to balance the scales after all the wrong I did in the war." Eleanor's expression softened slightly. "What wrong could you have done? You were a soldier. Soldiers fight." "I was good at it," Caleb said, the admission tasting bitter in his mouth. "Too good. I led raids behind Union lines, burned supply depots, destroyed bridges. Some of those bridges carried civilians. Some of those supply depots fed hungry families." He pulled off his worn leather gloves, showing her his hands in the moonlight. They were strong hands, marked by work and weather, but she seemed to understand what he was really showing her. The invisible stains that no amount of washing could remove. "These hands took lives," he continued. "Maybe it's time they saved one instead." Elena reached out tentatively, her fingers brushing across his knuckles with feather-light touch. The contact sent electricity up his arm, but there was nothing improper in the gesture. It was the touch of one wounded soul recognizing another. "If we leave," she said slowly, "he will come after us, and he will bring men with guns. Let him come." Caleb's voice carried the quiet confidence of a man who had faced down worse odds and lived to tell about it. "I know something about fighting, and I know something about running. We'll do whichever one serves us best." Elena was quiet for a long moment, her fingers still resting on his hands. When she spoke again, her voice was stronger, touched with something that might have been hope. "There is a place," she said. An old line shack about 10 miles north of here, near Willow Creek. It belonged to my family before everything. Changed. If we could reach it unseen, we might have a few days before he thinks to look there. Can you ride? She nodded. Better than most men, though it has been years since I had the chance. Then we leave tonight. Pack only what you can't live without. We'll travel light and fast. Elena rose from the bed, moving to a small wooden box on the room's single shelf. From it, she withdrew a few items, the battered Bible that held her. Pressed wildflower, a daguerreotype of people who must have been her family, and a small bundle wrapped in faded silk that clinked softly when she moved it. My grandmother's jewelry, she explained, seeing his questioning look. The only thing of value I have left. She also retrieved a bundle of clothes from beneath the bed, practical garments better suited for travel than the simple dresses she wore around the house. As she prepared to change, Caleb stepped toward the door. "I'll wait in the kitchen," he said. "5 minutes, Senor Hart." Her voice stopped him at the threshold. When he turned back, she was clutching the small bundle of her possessions against her chest like a shield. "If this goes wrong, if we are caught, we won't be. But if we are," she persisted, "promise me you will not let him take me alive." The request hit him like a physical blow. In her eyes, he saw not melodrama, but the calm certainty of someone who had measured her options and found them wanting. Whatever her life had been like under Whitmore's roof, she would rather die than return to it. "Promise me," she repeated. Caleb looked at this brave, broken woman who was asking him to be her salvation or her executioner, and felt something shift in his chest. Some final piece of his damaged soul clicking into place. "I promise," he said, "but it won't come to that. I'm going to get you out of here, Elena. I'm going to get you free." 5 minutes later, she emerged from her room dressed in dark clothing that would blend with the night. Her long hair was braided and pinned up beneath a worn hat, and she moved with the silent grace of someone who had learned to be invisible. Together, they slipped from the Baron's house and into a future that held either freedom or death. And for Elena Martinez, those had become the same thing. The horses' hooves drummed a steady rhythm against the hard-packed earth as Caleb and Eleanor rode through the pre-dawn darkness. They'd stolen the mounts from Whitmore's own stable, a fitting irony that brought the first genuine smile Caleb had. Seen cross Elena's face, she rode like she'd been born in the saddle, her body moving in perfect harmony with her horse despite years away from riding. "There," Eleanor said, pointing to a barely visible trail that branched off from the main road. "This will take us toward the creek, but away from the places searchers will look first." Caleb followed her lead, marveling at how she seemed to navigate, by instincts he couldn't fathom. The trail she'd chosen was little more than a deer path, winding through mesquite and scrub oak that would hide their passage from casual observation. "You know this country well," he observed, keeping his voice low despite the miles they'd put between themselves and Redemption Flats. "I was born on this land," Elena replied, her voice carrying an old sadness. "Before it became Baron Whitmore's land, it belonged to my family for 3 generations. My great-grandfather received it as a grant from the Republic of Mexico. My grandfather expanded it through honest work and fair dealing. My father—" She paused, her voice catching slightly. "My father died defending it." They rode in silence for a while, the only sounds the soft footfalls of their horses and the distant call of a night bird. As the eastern horizon began to lighten, with the first hints of dawn, Elena guided them toward a stand of cottonwoods that marked the presence of water. Willow Creek was little more than a stream now, reduced by the dry summer to a series of shallow pools connected by thin ribbons of flowing water. But it was enough for the horses, and more importantly, it would mask their tracks if anyone tried to follow their trail this far. Elena dismounted near a particularly dense thicket and began searching through the undergrowth. After a few minutes, she emerged with a piece of bark in her hand, flat and pale, perfect for drawing on. "What are you doing?" Caleb asked, watching as she settled herself on a fallen log and began sketching with a piece of charcoal from the previous night's campfire. They'd passed. "Making us a map," she said, her fingers moving with practiced precision across the bark surface. "The country ahead has changed since I was a child, but the bones of the land remain the same. Water sources, hidden valleys, places where a small group could hide or a large group might get lost." Caleb leaned over her shoulder to study her work, impressed by the detail and accuracy of her crude map. She'd marked not only geographical features, but also information that could mean the difference between life and death in this harsh country. Which springs ran year-round, which passes were too narrow for large groups of riders, which ranches had friendly owners, and which harbored men loyal to Whitmore. "This is remarkable," he said, genuine admiration in his voice. "You've got the eye of a military cartographer." Elena looked up at him, a ghost of a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "My father taught me to read the land before I could read books. He said a person who understands the country they live in will never be truly lost." Smart man. He was. Too smart, perhaps. He saw what men like Whitmore were doing, buying up land from desperate farmers, using legal tricks to claim property that wasn't rightfully theirs. He tried to organize the other Mexican landowners to resist, to fight the seizures in court, rather than with guns. What happened? Elena's expression darkened, and she looked away toward the creek where their horses drank. The courts were no more honest than the men trying to steal our land. When legal means failed, some of the younger men wanted to fight. My father counseled patience, said violence would only bring more violence. He was right about that, at least. But someone fought anyway. My oldest brother, Miguel. He gathered a group of vaqueros and rode to confront Whitmore's men when they came to put up new boundary markers on our land. There was shooting. Miguel and 3 others died. That night, our house burned. My parents died in the fire. Caleb felt something cold settle in his stomach. "And you?" "I was visiting my aunt in San Antonio. When I returned," she gestured vaguely at the empty landscape around them. "Everything was gone. Whitmore claimed the land as compensation for his men who had died in the attack on his legal survey crew. I had no money for lawyers, no family left to help me. He offered me shelter and employment out of the goodness of his heart." The bitter irony in her last words made Caleb's hands clench into fists. He'd seen enough of war to recognize a carefully orchestrated campaign when he heard one described. Whitmore hadn't just stolen Elena's land, he'd systematically destroyed her family and then positioned himself as her savior. "The debt he claims you owe is fiction," Elena said firmly. "My family paid their bills. We owed no one anything. But Whitmore has papers that say otherwise, signed by judges who are either bought or intimidated into supporting his claims." She finished her map and held it up for his inspection. The crude chart showed a route that would take them north and west, avoiding the main roads and settlements where Whitmore's influence was strongest. It was longer than a direct path, but it offered concealment and options for escape if they were discovered. "How long to reach this line shack?" Caleb asked, studying the route. 2 days of hard riding, if the weather holds. 3 if we're careful to avoid being seen. We'll be careful. But Elena, he met her eyes, wanting her to understand the full scope of what they were attempting. "Once we leave this creek, there's no going back. Whitmore will never stop hunting for you, and anyone who helps you will become his enemy too." "I know." Her voice was steady, but he could see the fear she was working to control. "But I would rather die free than live as his property for one more day." They mounted their horses and continued north, following Elena's carefully planned route through country that grew more rugged with each mile. The sun climbed steadily, turning the morning cool into the beginning of another scorching day, but they made good time through terrain that would have challenged a larger group. It was nearly noon when Elena suddenly raised her hand, signaling for them to stop. She tilted her head, listening intently to sounds Caleb couldn't detect. "Riders," she whispered, "coming from the south. moving fast. Caleb strained his ears and finally caught it, the distant thunder of hooves on hard ground, growing steadily. Louder. Too many horses for casual travelers, moving with the purposeful speed of a hunting party. "How many?" he asked, already scanning the landscape for cover. "6, maybe 8, and they know where they're going." Eleanor's face had gone pale, but her voice remained steady. "He must have discovered I was gone sooner than we hoped. Can they track us this far? Whitmore employs men who can track a ghost." "Across solid rock." She pointed toward a cluster of boulders about a quarter-mile ahead. "We need to reach those rocks before they see us in the open." They spurred their horses forward, no longer concerned with concealing their trail. Speed was more important than stealth now, and both animals seemed to sense the urgency. Behind them, the sound of pursuit grew steadily louder. They reached the rocks with minutes to spare, leading their horses into the maze of stone that offered both concealment and, if necessary, defensive positions. Elena's intimate knowledge of the country was proving invaluable. She guided them to a spot where they could observe their back trail without being seen. The hunting party appeared a few minutes later, 8 riders spread out in a search formation. Even at a distance, Caleb could see they were well-armed and experienced. These weren't casual cowboys pressed into service. They were professional trackers, the kind of men who made their living hunting fugitives and runaway slaves. "He's taking this seriously," Caleb murmured, watching as the riders studied the ground where their trail disappeared into the rocky terrain. "He cannot afford to let me escape," Elena replied. "I know too much about his business dealings, about where the bodies are buried." Literally, in some cases, the lead tracker dismounted and began examining the ground more closely, his movements methodical and patient. After several minutes, he remounted and gestured toward the rocks where they were hidden. "Time to go," Caleb said grimly. "They found our trail." They rode hard for the next hour, Elena leading them through a maze of arroyos and rocky washes that would confuse their trail. The sun climbed toward its zenith, turning the air into a shimmering furnace that made breathing an effort. But they pressed on, knowing that their pursuers would be suffering equally from the heat. When they finally stopped to rest the horses, they'd reached a small box canyon where a trickle of spring water provided blessed relief for both riders and mounts. Elena dismounted with fluid grace despite the hours in the saddle, and Caleb found himself watching her with growing admiration. The pampered captive he'd imagined rescuing had revealed herself to be a woman of remarkable strength and resourcefulness. "We've bought ourselves some time," Elena said, studying their back trail. "But not much. They'll figure out our route eventually." Caleb nodded, his mind already working on their next move. But as Elena knelt by the spring to fill their water bottles, he noticed something that made his chest tighten. The hard riding had taken its toll on her. Beneath the determined facade, he could see exhaustion in the careful way she moved. The slight tremor in her hands. "You're hurt," he said, moving to her side. "I'm fine." But even as she said it, she swayed slightly, and Caleb caught her arm to steady her. "No, you're not." His voice was gentle but firm. "Show me." After a moment's hesitation, Elena pulled back the sleeve of her riding jacket. The bruises on her arm had darkened to deep purple, and there was swelling around her wrist that suggested possible fracture. She'd been riding for hours with injuries that would have felled a lesser person. "Elena," Caleb breathed, carefully, examining the damage. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because there was nothing to be done about it, and we needed to run." She met his eyes, and he saw not self-pity, but the pragmatic acceptance of someone who had learned to endure pain without complaint. "I have survived worse." The simple statement hit him harder than any dramatic declaration might have. Looking at her bruised face and damaged wrist, Caleb felt something shift in his chest, a fierce protectiveness that went beyond mere chivalry or moral obligation. "Here," he said, pulling a bandana from his saddlebag. "Let me bind that wrist. It'll give you some support." Elena allowed him to work, sitting still as he carefully wrapped the makeshift bandage around her injured joint. His hands were surprisingly gentle for their size, and she found herself studying his face as he concentrated on the task. There was something different about this man, a quality of careful strength that spoke of power held in check rather than power that had been broken. "You have done this before," she observed. "Field medicine. Every officer learned the basics during the war." He finished tying off the bandage and looked up at her. "Better?" Elena flexed her fingers experimentally. "Much, thank you." They sat in companionable silence for a few minutes, sharing the shade of an overhanging rock while their horses rested. The respite felt precious, a stolen moment of peace in the midst of their desperate flight. "Tell me about Colorado," Eleanor said eventually. "Your uncle's ranch." Caleb leaned back against the rock wall, his expression growing distant. "The Double Eagle sits in a valley about 50 miles south of Denver, with the Rocky Mountains rising up all around like the walls of a cathedral. Uncle Thomas built it up from nothing after he mustered out of the army, said the high country air was good for a man's soul." "You never visited him there?" "Once, when I was 16. Spent a summer learning to cowboy before I went off to West Point." Caleb's voice carried the warmth of good memories. "Best 3 months of my life up to that point. Thomas taught me to read the weather, to understand cattle, to see the land the way the Ute did before we pushed them out. But you chose the military instead. Family tradition. Hart men had served in every American war since the Revolution. I thought it was my duty." His laugh held no humor. "Thomas tried to warn me. Said the coming war would be different from the ones our fathers fought, that it would poison everything it touched. He was right about that." Elena heard the pain in his voice and recognized it as an echo of her own losses. "What will you do there?" "At the ranch? Raise cattle, horses, maybe build something instead of tearing things down for a change." He looked at her, his expression serious. "There's a foreman's house that sits empty, good water, plenty of room. You could have your own place, your own life." The offer hung in the air between them, heavy with implications neither was quite ready to examine. Elena looked away, her fingers unconsciously moving to her throat where her mother's cross had once rested. "You would do this for a stranger? Give me a home, ask nothing in return? You're not a stranger anymore." The simple honesty in his voice made her look back at him. "And I would ask for something." Elena's expression grew guarded, old fears rising. Despite herself, "Your friendship," Caleb continued quickly, seeing her reaction. "Your help building something good. A partnership between equals. Nothing more unless—" He stopped, color rising in his cheeks. "Unless?" she prompted, though her voice was barely a whisper. "Unless someday you wanted it to be more." The words hung between them like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross. Elena felt her heart beating faster, not from fear this time, but from something far more dangerous. Hope. It had been so long since anyone had offered her choice, had spoken to her as an equal rather than property to be claimed or discarded. She began, then stopped, as the sound of distant hoofbeats echoed off the canyon walls. They were on their feet instantly, moving with the efficiency of a team that had learned to trust each other's instincts. Caleb gathered their gear, while Elena soothed the horses, both of them working in silent coordination. "How close?" Caleb asked as he tightened his saddle cinch. Elena tilted her head, listening to sounds that spoke to her of wind and weather and the movement of riders across terrain she knew like her own heartbeat. "Close enough. They've spread out to cover more ground, but they're still following our general direction. Can we outrun them? For a while. But the horses are tired, and the country ahead offers less cover." She swung into her saddle with fluid grace despite her injuries. "There is another option. I'm listening. The old Ramirez line shack is still about 6 hours ahead, but there's an abandoned mine shaft about 2 hours north of here. We could hole up there, wait for them to pass by, or get trapped like rats if they find us." Elena's smile held a sharp edge. "The mine has 3 ways out if you know where to look. And I know every inch of that ground. My grandfather used to bring me there to collect certain stones for my grandmother's jewelry. It was a risk either way. Continue running on tired horses with professional trackers closing in, or trust Elena's knowledge of terrain he'd never seen. But looking at her face, seeing the quiet confidence there, Caleb found his decision was already made. Lead the way. They rode out of the box canyon into the blazing afternoon heat, their horses' hooves finding purchase on rock that would hopefully confuse their trail. Behind them, the sound of pursuit grew steadily fainter as they climbed toward higher ground, where the air was slightly cooler, but the terrain far more treacherous. As they rode, Elena began to tell him stories of the land they traveled through. How her grandmother had collected turquoise and silver from the abandoned mines. How her grandfather had made his fortune finding water in places other men saw only desert. Her voice painted pictures of a time when this country had been home to families who understood its rhythms, who worked with the land rather than against it. Listening to her speak, watching the way she seemed to become more herself with each mile they put between them and Whitmore's reach, Caleb felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the possibility of a future worth building. Whatever happened in the next few days, whatever dangers they faced together, he was beginning to understand that finding Eleanor might have saved them both. The abandoned mineshaft was exactly where Elena had promised. A dark mouth in the hillside, hidden by a screen of juniper and oak that made it nearly invisible from the main trail. They led their horses inside, just as the first drops of an unexpected summer storm began to patter against the rocks outside. "God provides," Elena murmured, listening to the rain that would wash away their tracks more effectively than any human effort. The mine extended back into the hill for about 50 yards before branching into the 3 passages Elena had mentioned. They made camp in the main chamber, where a natural chimney in the rock would disperse any smoke from a small fire. As darkness fell outside and the rain intensified, they found themselves in a pocket of warmth and relative safety for the first time since leaving Redemption Flats. Elena sat beside the small fire, her injured wrist resting in her lap as she stared into the flames. In the flickering light, Caleb could see exhaustion written in every line of her body, but there was something else too. A gradual relaxation of muscles held tense for too many years. "You're safe," he said quietly, reading her expression. "At least for tonight." "Am I?" She looked up at him, and he was surprised to see tears glistening in her eyes. "I keep waiting to wake up back in that room, to discover this is all a dream born of desperation." Caleb moved to sit beside her, careful to maintain a respectful distance, even as he wanted to offer comfort. "It's real, Elena. You're free. Free." She tested the word like she was tasting something foreign. I had almost forgotten what that felt like. The rain drummed steadily against the hillside, creating a curtain of sound that isolated them from the outside world. In this small pocket of warmth and safety, the barriers they'd both maintained began to lower slightly. "Tell me about your nightmares," Caleb said gently, "the ones that wake you in the middle of the night." Elena's hand moved unconsciously to her throat, seeking the comfort of a cross that was no longer there. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I dream about the fire, about my parents calling for help that never came. Sometimes I dream that I could have saved them if I had been there, if I had been stronger, braver. Other times," she stopped, her breath catching. Other times I dream that I am grateful I was not there to burn with them. And that makes me the worst kind of daughter." Caleb felt something break open in his chest at the raw pain in her voice. "Elena, no. Survivor's guilt is a poison, but it's not truth. You were spared for a reason, to become Baron Whitmore's property, to endure 4 years of—" She shuddered, unable to finish the sentence. "To be here now, to be free, to help me understand that redemption is possible." He met her eyes across the small fire. "You want to know about my nightmares? I dream about a bridge outside Richmond. Union supply train was coming through, carrying medical supplies to a field hospital. I ordered it destroyed anyway, because those were my orders. 43 people died when that bridge collapsed, Elena. Doctors, Nurses, wounded soldiers who couldn't be evacuated in time. Elena watched his face in the firelight, seeing the weight he carried in every line, every shadow. You were a soldier following orders. I was a man who chose duty over conscience. Every night for 2 years, I've seen their faces. I've heard them calling for help that I made sure wouldn't come. And now? Caleb was quiet for a long moment, gathering his thoughts. Now I think maybe I understand why I survived when better men didn't. Maybe it was so I could be on that street when you needed someone to refuse to look away. Elena reached across the space between them, her fingers finding his in the flickering light. The contact was electric, but also something deeper, the touch of one wounded soul recognizing another. We are quite a pair, she said softly. 2 people running from ghosts. Maybe we don't have to run anymore. The words hung between them, weighted with possibility and hope. Elena's fingers tightened on his, and for a moment the years of pain and isolation seemed to recede like a tide going out. Caleb, she whispered, and the way she said his name made something flutter in his chest like wings, trying to remember how to fly. He leaned toward her, drawn by something stronger than caution or propriety. But Elena suddenly stiffened, her head turning toward the mine entrance. Someone's coming. Caleb listened, his soldier's instincts sharpening. There the soft whinny of a horse, quickly muffled, the careful scrape of boots on wet stone. Their pursuers had found them. They moved with silent efficiency, extinguishing the fire and gathering their gear. Elena led him toward one of the branching tunnels, her steps sure despite the darkness. Behind them, voices echoed from the main entrance, rough men's voices, discussing the best way to smoke out their quarry. This way, Elena breathed, guiding him deeper into the mine. The tunnel she'd chosen was narrow and low, forcing them to move in single file with their hands trailing along the walls for guidance. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, Elena stopped. There's a vertical shaft here, she whispered. It connects to the old air vent about 30 yards up the hill. Can you climb? Caleb felt upward, his hands finding rough, handholds carved into the rock. Yes, you go first. I'll be right behind you. The climb was treacherous in the darkness, made worse by Elena's injured wrist and the echoing voices of the men searching the mine below them. But Elena climbed with determination born of desperation, and Caleb followed, ready to catch her if she fell. They emerged from the hidden air vent into the storm-lashed night, rain immediately soaking through their clothes. Their horses were gone, probably discovered and confiscated by their pursuers, but they were alive and free. Now what? Caleb asked, having to raise his voice to be heard over the storm. Elena wiped rain from her eyes, her dark hair plastered to her skull. In the lightning flashes, she looked like some wild spirit of the desert, beautiful and fierce and utterly unbroken. Now we walk, she said. The line shack is still 12 miles north, but there are places to shelter along the way, places they'll never think to look. As they set off into the storm, Elena pulled something from her pocket, a small bundle wrapped in oiled cloth. Inside was a pressed wildflower, the petals still holding traces of their original color despite being dried, and preserved between the pages of her Bible. My grandmother taught me that even in the harshest places, beauty can survive if it has roots strong enough, she said, carefully rewrapping the flower. She said that someday, when I found ground worth planting in, I should remember that lesson. Caleb watched her tuck the precious flower back into her pocket, understanding instinctively that she was sharing something sacred with him. In return, he pulled off one of his worn leather gloves and began working at something attached to it, a small piece of bent metal that he'd shaped during their rest at the spring. What is that? Eleanor asked. A promise, Caleb said, holding up what he'd created. It was crude and rough, fashioned from a horseshoe nail he'd found at their first camping spot, but it had been shaped with care into a simple ring. If you'll have it? Elena stared at the makeshift ring, her breath catching in her throat. Caleb, not asking you to marry me, he said quickly, though color rose in his cheeks. Not yet, But I'm asking you to accept my promise that you'll never be anyone's property again, that whatever comes, we'll face it together, as equals." Elena held out her hand, her fingers trembling slightly as Caleb slipped the crude ring onto her finger. It fit imperfectly, but it felt more real than any gold band ever could. "Vows spoken in a storm," she murmured. "My grandmother would have said that makes them especially binding." Together they walked into the night, two souls bound by shared pain and the fragile hope of redemption. Behind them, frustrated voices echoed from the mine as their pursuers realized their quarry had vanished like smoke. Ahead lay uncertainty and danger, but also the possibility of a future neither had dared to imagine. The storm raged around them, but Elena clutched the bent horseshoe nail ring like a talisman, and for the first time in 4 years, she allowed herself to believe that morning might actually come. They reached the line shack as the storm was breaking, exhausted and soaked to the bone, but alive. The small structure sat in a grove of cottonwoods, beside what had once been a thriving creek, its adobe walls weathered but still solid after years of abandonment. Elena stood before it for a long moment, her hand pressed against the wooden door as if drawing strength from the contact. "This was our eastern boundary marker," she said quietly. "My father built this shack when I was 12, and I helped him mix the adobe. I carved my initials in that beam there, see?" Caleb looked where she pointed and saw the faint marks. EMR, Elena Maria Ramirez. Below them, in a different hand, were other initials, MR and DR Miguel and Diego, Elena explained, her voice thick with memory. "My brothers. We thought these walls would stand forever, that our children would play here someday." Inside, the shack was sparse but functional, a single room with a stone fireplace, a rough wooden table, and sleeping alcoves built into the walls. Someone had been here recently. The fireplace was clean, and there were supplies stacked neatly on shelves that Eleanor didn't remember leaving. "Travelers," she said in answer to Caleb's questioning look. "This has always been a shelter for anyone who needed it. My father taught us that the desert makes brothers of all men, regardless of their other differences." They built a fire and spread their wet clothes to dry, sharing the simple meal of jerked beef and hardtack they'd carried with them. For the first time since leaving Redemption Flats, they could rest without constantly listening for pursuit. The storm had covered their tracks, and Elena was confident that their pursuers would assume they'd continued north toward the main roads. "We should be safe here for a day or two," she said, settling beside the fire. "Long enough to plan our next move." Caleb nodded, but something was troubling him. "Elena, about those papers Whitmore claims to have, the ones that supposedly prove your family's debt, is there any chance they could be real?" Elena's expression hardened. "My father kept meticulous records. We owed no one anything when he died. Every debt was paid, every obligation met. Whitmore's papers are forgeries, but convincing ones. What about your family's original land grants, the deeds that proved your ownership? Burned with the house, along with everything else that mattered." Elena's voice carried old bitterness. "Whitmore made sure of that. Without the original documents, proving my family's claim would be nearly impossible. Nearly impossible isn't the same as impossible." Elena looked at him sharply. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking that a man like Whitmore doesn't destroy evidence. He hides it. Those original documents might still exist somewhere, along with records that could prove what really happened to your family. Even if they do, how could we possibly—" Eleanor stopped mid-sentence, her eyes widening as if she'd suddenly remembered. "Something important. What is it?" Elena rose and moved to one of the sleeping alcoves, running her hands along the adobe wall with sudden urgency. "When I was 16, just before the trouble started, my father became worried about the increasing pressure from men like Whitmore. He made copies of all our important documents, land grants, deeds, legal correspondence, and hid them. Here, Not just here, in several places throughout our old territory. He called them insurance against thieves and liars. Elena's fingers found what they were seeking, a loose stone in the wall that shifted when pressed. Behind it was a small cavity, and from it she withdrew a bundle wrapped in oiled leather. With trembling hands, she unwrapped the package, revealing not documents, but a single faded daguerreotype, a formal portrait of a distinguished Mexican family. A man with Elena's eyes and determined jaw stood beside a woman of quiet dignity, their hands resting on the shoulders of 3 children. The youngest was clearly Elena, perhaps 14 years old, with the same proud bearing she maintained even. "Now, my family," she whispered, her fingers tracing the faces in the photograph, the last picture we had taken together. But Caleb was studying the image more closely, his expression growing troubled. "Elena, look at the background. That building behind your family. What is it?" Elena examined the daguerreotype more carefully. "The territorial courthouse in San Antonio. We had business there that day, something to do with updating our land records. Father said it was important to have everything properly documented." "When was this taken?" "Early spring of 1863, just a few months before." Elena stopped, sudden understanding dawning in her eyes. "Santa Maria. The courthouse. Father filed copies of all our documents there as part of the territorial record. If they still exist, they'd prove everything. Your family's ownership, the circumstances of their deaths, maybe even evidence of Whitmore's involvement." Caleb felt excitement building in his chest. "Elena, you're not just a runaway servant. You're the rightful heir to thousands of acres of prime grazing land. But how could we prove it? We can't exactly walk into the courthouse and demand to see the records. Whitmore has too much influence, too many friends in official places. We don't need to walk in," Caleb said slowly, an idea forming. "I know someone who could help us, someone who owes me a favor from the war." "Who?" Judge Marcus Webb. He served under me during the siege of Vicksburg. Lost his arm saving my life during a Confederate assault. After the war, he studied law and got himself appointed as a territorial judge. If anyone could access those records legally and discreetly, it would be Marcus. Eleanor stared at the daguerreotype. In her hands, seeing not just the faces of her dead family, but the possibility of justice she'd never dared to hope for. "You would do this? Risk everything to help me reclaim what was stolen? Elena, don't you understand?" Caleb moved to kneel beside her, his hands covering hers where they held the precious photograph. "This changes everything. You're not just a woman running from an abusive master. You're a landowner fighting to reclaim what's rightfully yours. This isn't just about freedom anymore. It's about justice. And if we're wrong, if the documents don't exist or don't prove what we hope they will, then we continue to Colorado as planned. But if we're right, if we can prove your claim, then you won't just be free. You'll have the power to ensure that what happened to your family never happens to anyone else." Elena looked from the daguerreotype to the crude ring on her finger, seeing symbols of past and future, loss and hope. The girl in the photograph had been innocent, protected by her family's love and the certainty that justice would always triumph over cruelty. That girl had died in the flames that consumed her home, but the woman who had survived, who had endured 4 years of brutality without breaking, who had kept her dignity intact through sheer force of will, that woman was capable of things the girl had never imagined. "San Antonio is over 100 miles from here," she said slowly, "through country Whitmore controls or influences. Even if we could reach Judge Webb safely, there's no guarantee he'd be willing to help. Marcus Webb is a good man. He'll help. If he can." Caleb's voice carried quiet confidence. "But Elena, this has to be your choice. I won't lie to you, it's dangerous. We'd be gambling everything on the chance that those documents exist and that we can use them to bring Whitmore down." Elena was quiet for a long time, staring into the fire as she weighed options that all carried terrible risks. She could continue. running, start over in Colorado with Caleb's protection and the hope of building a simple, peaceful life. Or she could turn back toward the heart of enemy territory, betting everything on the chance to reclaim not just her freedom, but her birthright. My father used to say that a person who runs from injustice carries it with them wherever they go, she said finally, that the only way to be truly free is to stand and fight for what's right, regardless of the cost. Your father was a wise man. He was also a dead man, killed for trying to do the right thing. Elena looked up at Caleb, her eyes reflecting the firelight like dark stars. But perhaps dying for justice is better than living with its absence. She stood and moved to the window, looking out at the moonlit landscape that had once belonged to her family. Somewhere out there, Baron Whitmore slept in comfort built on theft and murder, secure in his belief that his crimes would never be discovered or punished. "We go to San Antonio," she said firmly. "We find Judge Webb, we recover those documents, and we make Whitmore pay for what he's stolen." Caleb felt a mixture of pride and terror at the determination in her voice. The frightened woman he'd rescued was gone, replaced by someone harder and more dangerous, someone with nothing left to lose and everything to gain. "Together?" he asked. Eleanor turned from the window, the faded daguerreotype still clutched in her hand like a battle flag. Together. Outside, the storm clouds were breaking up, revealing stars that seemed to shine with unusual brightness. In the morning, they would begin the most dangerous part of their journey, not running away from their past, but riding straight toward a confrontation that would either destroy them or set them free. Either way, Elena Maria Ramirez was finally going home. The journey to San Antonio took 4 days of careful travel through country that seemed to hold its breath in the summer heat. Elena had traded her simple dress for men's clothing found in the line shack, worn denim pants and a cotton shirt that had belonged to one of her brothers. With her hair braided and hidden beneath a hat, she could pass for a young vaquero at a distance, which might buy them precious seconds if they encountered Whitmore's men. Caleb had spent hours studying his loaded Colt revolver each evening, cleaning and checking the mechanism with the methodical precision of a soldier preparing for his final battle. The weight of the weapon at his hip felt different now. Not just a tool for survival, but an instrument of justice waiting to be wielded. "Tell me about Judge Webb," Eleanor said on their third night, as they camped in an abandoned ranch house that bore the scars of some long-ago conflict. Marcus was barely 19 when the war started, younger than most of the men under my command. But he had the kind of quiet courage that doesn't make speeches, just does what needs to be done. Caleb's voice carried the warmth of old friendship mixed with the weight of shared trauma. "During the siege of Vicksburg, a Confederate sharpshooter had us pinned down in a collapsed building. Marcus crawled 50 yards through broken glass and falling debris to flank the position. Lost his left arm below the elbow when a shell fragment tore through it, but he never made a sound. And after the war, studied law with a passion that surprised everyone who knew him. Said he'd seen enough of what happened when men settled disputes with bullets, wanted to learn how to settle them with books instead." Caleb poked at their small fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling up into the darkness. "Last letter I got from him, he was working to reform the territorial court system, trying to make it more honest. If anyone can help us navigate the legal maze Whitmore has built around your case, it's Marcus." Eleanor nodded, but Caleb could see the worry in her expression. They were betting everything on the integrity of a man she'd never met, in a system that had already failed her family once. "What if he can't help us?" she asked quietly. "What if the documents don't exist, or they're not enough to prove our case?" It was a question that had haunted Caleb's thoughts for the past 3 days. "Then we make sure Whitmore faces justice another way." The implication hung between them, unspoken but understood. Elena studied his face in the firelight, seeing the transformation that had been taking place since they'd left the line shack. The drifting veteran who had intervened in a street confrontation was gone, replaced by someone harder and more purposeful. a man who had found his cause at last. "You're ready to kill him," she observed, not judging but simply acknowledging the truth, if necessary. Caleb met her eyes steadily. "I've killed men for worse reasons. At least this time it would be for something that matters." Elena was quiet for a moment, turning the crude ring on her finger as she considered his words. "My father believed that violence only breeds more violence, that justice achieved through killing is no justice at all. Your father was probably right, but your father is dead, and the men who killed him are still drawing breath." Caleb's voice carried the weight of hard experience. "Sometimes the choice isn't between right and wrong, Elena. Sometimes it's between justice and peace, and you can't have both." They reached the outskirts of San Antonio as the sun was setting on their fourth day of travel, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that reminded Elena of the last peaceful sunset she'd watched from her family's ranch. The city had grown since her last visit, spreading beyond its original boundaries as settlers and fortune-seekers continued to pour into Texas. "Judge Webb's office is near the courthouse," Caleb said, studying the layout of streets that had changed considerably since his own last visit. "But we can't just walk in there. Whitmore probably has people watching for us by now." Elena pointed toward a collection of modest buildings on the city's eastern edge. "The Mexican Quarter. I have distant relatives there. People who knew my family before the Troubles. They might give us shelter and information." It was a risk, but a calculated one. They made their way through narrow streets that smelled of cooking food and wood smoke, past adobe houses where families gathered on front steps to escape the heat of closed rooms. Elena pulled her hat low and kept her head down, but several people looked at them with the careful attention that strangers always received in close-knit communities. They found the house Elena was looking for, a neat adobe structure with bright blue trim and a small garden where herbs and vegetables grew despite the difficult soil. An elderly woman sat in the doorway, her fingers working steadily at some intricate needlework. "Tia Esperanza," Elena called softly. The old woman looked up, her eyes narrowing as she studied the two dusty travelers. For a moment, Caleb thought they'd made a mistake, that Elena had misjudged her welcome or misremembered the relationship. Then recognition dawned in the elderly woman's face, followed immediately by shock and something that might have been fear. "Elena, Dios mío, child, what are you doing here? They say you are dead." "Not dead, Tia, but not alive either until recently." Elena removed her hat, letting her long hair fall free as she embraced the older woman. "This is Caleb Hart. He helped me escape from Baron Whitmore." Esperanza's expression hardened at the mention of Whitmore's name, but she stepped back to allow them into her house. "Come quickly. We cannot speak of such things in the street." Inside, the house was simple but comfortable, filled with the kind of accumulated treasures that spoke of a life well lived. Religious icons shared space with family photographs, and the smell of fresh tortillas filled the air with warmth and "Welcome! Sit," Esperanza commanded, bustling toward her kitchen. "You look like you have not eaten properly in days. We will talk while you restore your strength." As she prepared food with the efficiency of long practice, Elena told her story, the escape from Whitmore's house, their flight across the desert, and the discovery that might prove her family's claim to their stolen land. Esperanza listened, without interruption, her weathered hands never pausing in their work. When Elena finished, the old woman was quiet for a long time, ladling beans and rice onto plates with thoughtful deliberation. "You know this is madness," she said finally. "Whitmore has powerful friends, money enough to buy any verdict he wants. Even if you found these documents, what judge would rule against him?" "Judge Marcus Webb," Caleb said. "He's an honest man, and he owes me his life." "Ah, yes, Webb." Esperanza set plates before them, her expression thoughtful. "I know of him. They say he cannot be bought or frightened, which makes him either very brave or very foolish. Perhaps both. Will you help us?" Elena asked. Esperanza sat down heavily, her joints creaking with the weight of years. "Your father was my brother's son. When he died, I wept for 3 days, not just for him, but for the justice that died with him. If there is a chance to make things right, then yes, I will help. But Elena, you must understand the risks. If you fail, Whitmore will not simply reclaim you. He will make an example that ensures no one ever challenges him again. I understand. Eleanor's voice was steady, but Caleb could see the fear she was working to control. But I cannot spend the rest of my life running from shadows. Either I reclaim what was stolen, or I die trying. There is no middle ground. Esperanza nodded slowly, recognizing the stubborn pride that had been a Ramirez family trait for generations. Very well. Judge Webb holds court in the morning, but his office hours end early on Fridays. If you wish to speak with him privately, that would be your best opportunity. What about the courthouse records? Caleb asked. More difficult. The territorial archives are kept in the basement, and access is restricted. But there is a clerk there, a young man named Diego Morales, whose father once worked for the Ramirez family. He might be willing to help, for the right reasons and the right price. Eleanor reached for the small bundle of her grandmother's jewelry that she'd carried through their entire flight. Would this be enough? Esperanza examined the pieces, simple silver work set with turquoise and garnets, the kind of jewelry that represented prosperity without ostentation. For Diego, yes. He's a good boy who sends most of his wages to his sick mother in Laredo. This would pay for medicine she needs but cannot afford. As they planned their approach to both Judge Webb and the courthouse archives, Caleb found himself studying Elena's face in the lamplight. The frightened woman he'd rescued had been replaced by someone who radiated quiet determination and carefully controlled anger. She was beautiful, but it was the beauty of forged steel, shaped by fire, into something that could cut or bend without breaking. There's something else, Esperanza said as the evening wore on. Word has reached San Antonio that you escaped from Whitmore. He is offering a substantial reward for your return, alive and unharmed. But there are rumors of other men, professional killers from as far away as El Paso, who care more about the money than the condition you're returned in. Caleb's hand moved instinctively to his gun. How substantial a reward? $2,000. Enough to tempt men who would not normally involve themselves in domestic disputes. Elena's face went pale. $2,000. That's more than most men see in 5 years. It tells us how badly he wants you back, Caleb said grimly. And how much he fears what you might know or prove, which means we have very little time, Esperanza added. If you are going to act, it must be tomorrow. Every day you remain in San Antonio increases the chance that someone will recognize you and claim that reward. Eleanor looked from her aunt to Caleb, seeing her own understanding reflected in their faces. They had perhaps 12 hours to gather evidence, present it to Judge Webb, and somehow convince him to act before Whitmore's hired killers found them. Then tomorrow it is, she said firmly, touching the faded daguerreotype in her pocket. Win or lose, this ends tomorrow. Caleb checked his revolver one final time, ensuring each chamber was loaded and ready. Tomorrow, they would either restore Elena's birthright or die in the attempt. After years of drifting without purpose, he found the clarity surprisingly comforting. Justice, he had learned, was worth any price, even their lives. Dawn came too soon and not soon enough. Elena had slept fitfully, her dreams filled with images of burning houses and faceless men with guns. She woke to find Caleb already dressed and checking his weapons with the methodical precision of a soldier. Preparing for battle. Today, she said simply, not trusting her voice with more words. Today, he agreed. Esperanza had prepared a breakfast of eggs and fresh tortillas, but Elena could barely manage a few bites. The weight of what they were attempting pressed down on her like a physical burden. In a few hours, she would either reclaim her family's legacy or lose everything, including quite possibly her life. The courthouse opens at 8, Esperanza said, pouring strong coffee into thick ceramic mugs. Diego usually arrives early to prepare the daily dockets. If you reach him before the building fills with people, you'll have the best chance of accessing the archives without drawing attention. Elena nodded, her fingers working nervously at the crude ring Caleb had made for her. The bent horseshoe nail had become a talisman, a reminder that even the simplest materials could be shaped into something meaningful when handled with care and purpose. "And Judge Webb?" Caleb asked. "His office is on the second floor of the courthouse. He usually reviews cases alone for an hour before court convenes. But be warned, he is a cautious man who has survived in territorial politics by trusting slowly and completely." They left Esperanza's house as the sun was painting the adobe walls of San Antonio in shades of gold and pink. Elena had bound her hair tightly and pulled her hat low, but there was no disguising the tension in her movements or the way her eyes constantly scanned their surroundings for threats. The courthouse was a substantial building of local limestone, its Greek revival columns speaking of ambitions toward civilization in a land still raw with frontier justice. Early morning shadows provided some concealment as they approached through the nearly empty streets, but Elena felt exposed nonetheless. "There," Caleb said quietly, pointing toward a young man unlocking a side entrance to the building. "That must be Diego." Diego Morales was perhaps 25, with the careful posture and ink-stained fingers of a clerk who took pride in his work. He looked up nervously as they approached, his hand moving instinctively toward the keys at his belt. "Señor Morales?" Elena said softly, removing her hat so he could see her face clearly. "I am Elena Ramirez. I believe you knew my father." Recognition dawned in the young man's eyes, followed quickly by shock and something that might have been fear. "Señorita Ramirez, but we heard. That is, people said you were dead. Not dead, but not truly alive either. Until recently." Elena's voice carried the weight of 4 years' worth of survival. "I need your help, Diego. I need to see the territorial records from 1863. Specifically, any documents filed by my father regarding our family's landholdings." Diego glanced nervously at Caleb, clearly unsure how much he should trust this strange request from a woman who was supposed to be dead or disappeared. "It's dangerous," he said finally. "Baron Whitmore has many friends in this building. If they knew I was helping you—" Elena reached into her pocket and withdrew her grandmother's jewelry, the silver and turquoise catching the morning light like captured stars. "This is all I have left of my family's wealth, but my aunt tells me your mother is ill, that she needs medicine you cannot afford." Diego's eyes widened as he looked at the jewelry. It represented more money than he could earn in 2 years of careful clerking, enough to save his mother's life and perhaps secure his own future, but accepting it would also mark him as Elena's ally in whatever conflict was brewing. "If someone discovers what I've done, then you were threatened by armed strangers and had no choice," Caleb said firmly. "No one will blame you for preserving your life and your mother's." After a long moment, Diego nodded and unlocked the courthouse door. "Quickly," he said, "before others arrive." The basement archives were a maze of wooden filing cabinets and document boxes, organized according to a system that seemed to make sense only to the clerks who maintained it. Diego moved through the maze with practiced efficiency, pulling out drawer after drawer as he searched for the records from 1863. "Here," he said finally, withdrawing a thick folder marked with the Ramirez name. "Your father was very thorough. He filed copies of everything: original land grants from the Mexican government, surveys conducted after Texas joined the Union, correspondence with territorial officials, even receipts for taxes paid." Elena's hands trembled as she opened the folder, revealing documents that proved her family's legitimate ownership of thousands of acres of prime grazing land. But it was the last document in the file that made her gasp. A formal complaint filed with the territorial governor, detailing Whitmore's attempts to claim Ramirez land through fraudulent debt claims and intimidation. "My father knew," she whispered. He documented everything, built a legal case against Whitmore months before he died. "And look at this," Caleb said, pointing to an official stamp at the bottom of the complaint. "It was received and acknowledged by the territorial government. That means there's an official record of your father's accusations." Diego nodded grimly, but nothing was ever done about it. The territorial governor at the time was known to be friendly with men like Whitmore. Your father's complaint was probably filed away and forgotten, but not destroyed, Elena said, her voice growing stronger. "The evidence exists. We have original documents that prove our ownership and official records of Whitmore's crimes." They spent the next 20 minutes making careful copies of the most important documents, Diego's practiced hand producing readable duplicates with impressive speed. When they were finished, Elena carefully returned her grandmother's jewelry. To Diego, who accepted it with a mixture of gratitude and fear. "What will you do now?" he asked. "Seek justice," Elena replied simply. As they left the courthouse basement, Elena clutched the original land grant documents against her chest like armor. After 4 years of being told she was nothing, that her family's claims were lies and fantasies, she held proof of who she really was. Not Whitmore's property, but the rightful heir to one of the largest ranches in South Texas. Now they just had to convince a judge to act on that proof and survive long enough to see justice done. Judge Marcus Webb's office occupied a corner of the courthouse's second floor, its tall windows offering a view of the plaza where vendors were beginning to set up their morning stalls. The man behind the heavy oak desk looked older than his, 32 years. His prematurely grey hair and lined face speaking of the weight that came with dispensing justice in a territory where law and order remained fragile constructs. His left sleeve was pinned neatly at the elbow, the empty fabric, a permanent reminder of the price he'd paid for his convictions. When Caleb knocked on the open door, Webb looked up from the case files scattered across his desk, and recognition dawned slowly in his tired eyes. "Caleb Hart," he said, rising from his chair with a slight smile. "I heard rumors you'd finally made it to Texas, though I have to admit, I expected you to arrive under different circumstances. Hello, Marcus. I wish this were a social call, but I need your help. We both do." Webb's attention shifted to Elena, taking in her men's clothing, her nervous posture, and the way she clutched a bundle of papers against her chest like a shield. His expression grew more serious as he gestured for them to sit in the chairs facing his desk. This wouldn't have anything to do with the rather substantial reward being offered for a certain runaway servant, would it? Webb asked, settling back into his chair. "Baron Whitmore has been quite vocal about his missing property." "She's not his property," Caleb said firmly, "and we can prove it." Elena leaned forward, her voice steady despite the enormity of what she was attempting. "Your Honor, my name is Elena Maria Ramirez. 4 years ago, Baron Whitmore murdered my family and stole our ranch through fraudulent legal claims. I have documents that prove our legitimate ownership and his crimes." Webb's eyebrows rose at the direct accusation, but he didn't interrupt as Elena carefully laid out the evidence they'd retrieved from the archives. The original Mexican land grants, the territorial surveys, the tax receipts, and most damaging of all, her father's formal complaint documenting Whitmore's criminal activities. The judge studied each document with the careful attention of a man who understood their significance. His expression grew increasingly grim as he read her father's detailed accusations and saw the official stamps that proved they'd been submitted to territorial authorities. "This is remarkable," Webb said finally. "If authentic, these documents completely contradict the claims Whitmore has made about your family's debts and his ownership of their lands." "They're authentic," Elena said firmly. "That's my father's handwriting, witnessed and notarized. The land grants bear the official seals of the Mexican government and the Republic of Texas." Webb nodded slowly, but his expression remained troubled. "The evidence is compelling, Miss Ramirez, but you have to understand the position this puts me in. Baron Whitmore is a powerful man with significant political connections. Accusations of this magnitude, murder, fraud, theft, they would require a full investigation, grand jury proceedings, possibly a criminal trial. Then start the investigation, Caleb said. Issue a warrant, seize Whitmore's records, interview. Witnesses, the truth will bear itself out, will it? Webb's question carried the weight of hard experience. How many witnesses to your family's murder are still alive, Miss Ramirez? How many people who might testify against Whitmore haven't already been bought, intimidated, or driven away? Elena felt something cold settle in her stomach. You won't help us. I didn't say that. Webb rose and moved to his window, looking down at the plaza where normal life continued unchanged. But I need you to understand what you're asking me to risk. If I move against Whitmore based on this evidence and fail to make the charges stick, my career is over. More than that, territorial judges who make powerful enemies have a tendency to suffer unfortunate accidents. So you'll do nothing? Caleb's voice carried the controlled anger of a man who'd seen too much injustice go unpunished. Webb turned back to face them, and Elena was surprised to see not cowardice in his expression, but careful calculation. I'll do what I can within the law. But Miss Ramirez, you need to understand that legal justice moves slowly, especially when it threatens established power structures. Even with this evidence, it could take months or years to build a case strong enough to bring Whitmore down. I don't have months, Elena said quietly. Every day I remain free, more bounty hunters arrive in San Antonio. Eventually someone will recognize me, claim Whitmore's reward, and I'll disappear forever. Webb was quiet for a long moment, studying the documents spread across his desk. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of decision. There is one possibility. If you were willing to make a public statement, to stand before the territorial court and formally accuse Whitmore of these crimes, it would create an official record that couldn't be ignored or buried. The territorial authorities would be forced to investigate. And in the meantime, Caleb asked, in the meantime, Miss Ramirez would be under the court's protection. Whitmore couldn't simply reclaim her without due process. Webb met Elena's eyes. Across his desk, but you have to understand what that means. You'd be placing yourself at the center of a very public legal battle with your life and freedom hanging in the balance. If we lose, at least we'll have tried, Elena said firmly. She touched the crude ring on her finger, drawing strength from its simple presence. Your Honor, I've spent 4 years as Baron Whitmore's property, 4 years believing that justice was impossible. If there's any chance at all, of reclaiming what he stole and preventing him from doing it to others, then I have to take it. Webb nodded slowly, recognizing the steel in her voice. Then we file the charges today. God help us all. 6 months later, Elena stood in the same courthouse where she had once fought for her freedom, but this time she wore a dress of deep blue silk that spoke of restored prosperity and hard-won dignity. The legal battles were finally over. Baron Whitmore sat in a territorial prison, his empire of stolen land and fraudulent claims dismantled by investigators who had uncovered a web of corruption reaching far beyond Elena's case. The simple gold wedding band on her finger caught the morning light streaming through the courthouse windows, purchased not with stolen wealth, but with the proceeds from the first cattle sale from the restored Ramirez ranch. It was a modest ring compared to the elaborate jewelry that more fashionable women wore, but to Eleanor it represented something far more precious than mere ornamentation, a union freely chosen between equals. Mrs. Hart, Judge Webb said, approaching. With the slightly formal manner he maintained even with friends, I wanted to congratulate you once more before you leave for Colorado. Your courage in coming forward has resulted in justice for more families than just your own. Elena smiled, thinking of the dozen other landowners who had reclaimed their property after Whitmore's records revealed the full scope of his criminal enterprise. Thank you, Your Honor. None of this would have been possible without your willingness to take risks for justice. Speaking of risks, Webb continued, I have news that might interest you both. The territorial governor has officially pardoned your husband for his actions during the war. His service in bringing Whitmore to justice, combined with testimonials from his former Union prisoners about his conduct as an officer, have cleared his record entirely. Caleb felt a weight lift from his shoulders that he'd carried for so long he'd forgotten what it felt like to stand without it. Thank you, Marcus. I didn't expect. Peace sometimes requires different kinds of courage than war, Webb said simply. You've both demonstrated that in abundance. As they left the courthouse, Eleanor slipped her hand into Caleb's, marveling at how natural the gesture had become. Their courtship had been conducted in the public eye during the months of legal proceedings, observed and judged by a community that had initially been skeptical of the tall Confederate veteran and the Mexican woman who dared challenge one of the territory's most powerful men. But as evidence mounted and Whitmore's crimes were exposed, public opinion had shifted. The wedding ceremony 2 weeks earlier had been attended by half the town, including many who had once crossed the street to avoid acknowledging Elena's existence. So, Caleb said as they walked toward the hotel where they would spend their last night in San Antonio, any regrets about leaving all this behind? Elena looked around at the bustling streets of the city that had become her unlikely sanctuary, then at the rolling hills beyond, where her family's ranch, her ranch, spread across thousands of acres of prime grazing land. It would have been easy to stay, to rebuild the life her family had lost, to become the kind of successful rancher her father had dreamed of being. None, she said firmly. This land holds too many ghosts, too much pain. Colorado will be a fresh start for both of us. They'd sold the ranch to a consortium of Mexican-American families who had lost their own lands to men like Whitmore, ensuring that the property would remain in hands that understood its true value. The money from the sale, combined with the inheritance from Caleb's uncle, would allow them to build something new in the high country, a different kind of legacy than the one Elena had been born to, but perhaps a better one. That evening, as they sat on the hotel's balcony, watching the sun set over San Antonio, Elena pulled out a letter that had arrived that morning from Colorado. "News from home?" Caleb asked, settling beside her with 2 cups of coffee. "From the foreman you hired to prepare the ranch for our arrival." Elena's voice carried excitement as she read from the letter. "He says the house repairs are nearly finished, and the first herd of cattle arrived safely from Kansas. The grazing looks excellent, and the water rights are secure through the end of the decade. And," Elena smiled, folding the letter carefully, "and he's found several Mexican families who lost their homes in Texas and are looking for work. Vaqueros who understand cattle, and women who can teach me the differences between high country ranching and what I knew as a child." Caleb nodded approvingly. "Building a community. Building a home." Eleanor leaned against his shoulder, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. "A place where people can start over, where the past doesn't have to define the future." "Speaking of the future," Caleb said carefully, "there's something we should discuss. I know we married quickly under unusual circumstances. If you ever want to, that is, if you decide that what we have isn't—" Eleanor silenced him with a gentle finger placed against his lips. "Caleb Hart, are you suggesting that I married you for convenience? I'm suggesting that you married me for survival, and now that you're safe and wealthy in your own right, you might want to reconsider." Elena was quiet for a moment, considering his words seriously. It was true that their relationship had been forged in desperate circumstances, that their wedding had been as much a legal necessity as a romantic gesture. But looking at this man who had risked everything to free her, who had stood by her side, through months of legal battles and public scrutiny, she felt nothing but certainty. "Do you remember what you told me that first night in the mine shaft?" she asked, "about needing redemption more than I needed rescue?" "I remember. I think we redeemed each other. not through grand gestures or dramatic sacrifices, but through the choice to see each other as we really are, not as property to be claimed or problems to be solved, but as equals worthy of love and respect. Caleb lifted her hand and kissed the simple gold band that marked their union. Then we're agreed. This is real, not just legal convenience. This is real, Elena confirmed. And it's just the beginning. The next morning found them on the northbound stage, their few possessions packed securely and their faces turned toward the future. As San Antonio disappeared behind them, Elena touched the small bundle in her pocket, the pressed wildflower from her grandmother's Bible, carefully preserved through all their trials. She'd planted one like it in the garden at the Colorado ranch, a symbol of beauty that could survive and flourish even in the harshest circumstances. Behind them lay a life reclaimed from theft and injustice. Ahead lay the promise of something entirely new, a partnership built on mutual respect, a love forged in shared struggle, and a future limited only by their courage to dream. Elena Ramirez Hart had finally come home.